Hello friends, and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three certified Pro Tools experts and instructors discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in the Avid official Facebook support forum. My name is Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer based in the UK, and on today's episode we're looking at a question from Sendy David San Andre. And he asks, before I upgraded to 2021.6 and 2021.7, my offline bounce was perfect. Started and created the perfect WAV since 0000. Now, the offline bounce starts with a delay, and in the WAV created, there's a missing 2 seconds approximately at the start. Any idea what's going on? Did I touch anything in settings? Thank you. So, we had a look at this, and we think we talked about this before, but when we were talking about bouncing to MP3, but one of our two resident geniuses thinks that there might be some extra stuff going on. So let me introduce you to these experty type people that are always with me on this thing. Welcome Anders Motz at Tonkraftwerk in Austria, but not quite today because he's somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm in Germany today. Hello.
And Andy Hageman, who is in fact in Tokyo. Welcome, Andy.
I am. How are you doing?
Doing good. Are you guys well? This is really early in the morning.
Yeah,
not for me. It's finally the afternoon. Finally I'm awake for this thing.
Okay, so Andy, what do you think is happening here?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things. First of all, is it I don't want to believe this to be true, but it's possible that he's bouncing to MP3. But he says wave, right? So
yes.
It hopefully isn't that. Now, if you
are
but bouncing,
I have some input on that.
All right.
Can I jump in right now? I was thinking about that as well. In the question, it says in the resulting wave there is a 2 millisecond gap or something. But if you drag an MP3 that you just bounced into Pro Tools, it turns into a WAV file again, right? And that might be the explanation.
So
it might be, right.
So I just want to comment on that. So bouncing to WAV, bouncing to MP3, dragging back into Pro Tools, which strips out 90% of the stuff, to turn it into a WAV, to then continue as a loss. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to believe it's true, but it would explain, that small amount at the beginning and a small amount at the end, because that's what. And we've already talked about that to death in another episode. That's what MP3 encoding does, right? That's why, for me, it's not the choice for things that need to be timed just right. Now, in the chat, there were a lot of folks talking about the difference between offline bounce and a real-time bounce, right? And there were a lot of folks going, you need to listen to your mixer last time. And I understand that. I always do quality control. I don't do it when I'm bouncing to disk. I always bounce to disk, and then I listen to it with something outside of Pro Tools. I shut down Pro Tools, and I listen to it through, anything other than Pro Tools, just to make sure that the file's right. Because just if you're hearing it through the speakers, if you're bouncing to disk, it does not necessarily mean that what you're bouncing. Everybody's bounced silence before in their life, inadvertently. You can still hear it through your speakers.
That's wise.
Right. So that bears a little bit of discussion. Now, in the past, prior to Pro Tools 11, there were two different mix engines, one for bouncing to disk and one for bouncing to track. And they were two small differences. One, bounce to disk, was the actual more mathematically accurate one. But bouncing to track was basically in the same mix engine that people were using. It was a very, very subtle difference that didn't make any difference in a majority of cases, but it did make a difference in some cases. When we went to Pro Tools 11, we timestamped everything. So our first most important thing to do was we wanted to make sure that bounce to disk and bounce to track were identical. And we solved that, right? So if you bounce to disk and if you bounce it internally, it's using the same mix engine all the time, right? And it was a better mix engine than the one that we had before and more consistent. And at the same time, go ahead.
And bounce to track is where in the bounce window you're selecting to re-import it back into the Pro Tools session, aren't you? Which means it requires the same.
No. I think he's talking about buzzing stuff into an audio track and recording the mix internally.
Yeah, I'm talking about internal bounce.
So printing.
Sorry. Thank you for
Printing to track. Yeah.
Because in the bounce window, we're able to re-import back into Pro Tools, but that requires the same sample rate. That's only active when the same sample rate is selected.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Thanks for keeping me honest. Now, while we were eliminating that discrepancy, we also could now do offline bounce, so faster than real-time bounce. That uses the same mix engine as well, right? So if you bounce in real time and if you bounce offline, it's the same result that you're going to get, with one possible exception. If you have plugins that are designed to emulate hardware devices and it's their behavior to be randomized, just like the hardware emulations, it doesn't matter the mix engine. Every time you play it, it's going to be a little bit different. But other than that, there's no sonic advantage to bouncing to track, bouncing to disk, offline bounce, or real-time bounce, as far as the audio quality of what you're going to get as a final product.
So that's just to clarify there. As Andy just was saying, so if you have plugins that are actually creating some kind of random harmonic content, like a simulator or something, that even if you bounce to tracks in Pro Tools, you're bouncing internally, you'll get different results on each bounce.
So this
there's another thing. Can I just do one more thing?
Okay.
Yeah, Andy said doing an offline bound is faster in real time, and it usually is, but there is a rare occasion where it actually can be slower than real time, and that is if you're using a lot of DSP processing on your HDX card. And when you're doing the offline bounds, it will not use the DSP power of the card. It will just use the internal processor. And it has to convert all of these plugins to their native formats, and that can actually take a bit longer time than real time.
Wow, interesting.
Sorry, Dave.
No, really interesting. That was a good interjection.
Was a good interjection.
So my question,
smart guy.
He's too clever for us, Andy.
He is.
He's really good at 9 o'clock in the morning Central Eastern Time.
He is. He's so much better than he normally is.
So my question
doesn't really mean anything.
So my question is when we offline bounce and real time bounce two Pro Tools files, and when you bounce multiple times the same selection, the rhetoric is that you put them together, phase reverse them, and they'll cancel out because they're always exactly the same, right?
That's right.
That's how it goes. Right. So if you get randomized noise, would that throw that off if you were to test that? So that would be a scenario then when someone's trying to do that and trying to test it, but they're getting different results. It's not the engine that's screwing up. It's the randomized nature of various emulations.
It's not even an error. It's the way it was designed to do. Now, by the way, none of this will cause a gap to be at the beginning, right? So, but it's worth mentioning, right? So, but there was, on that question was a discussion of real time versus not real time bounds. Now, if it's not an MP3 thing, and given the fact that whether or not they're doing internal or external or internal or bounce to disk or real time or not real time, that's a non-issue, right? So it's a worthy discussion that we just had, but it doesn't really relate to his problem. The other thing that might relate to his problem is what I'm going to show you here. Let me share my screen, and I did a little bit of prep work since I had some time this morning. All right, so I'm going to move all this stuff over here. Okay, great. So I have up here, and I won't play it for you because it's just a whole bunch of sine waves. I've got a sine wave that starts here, and then I've got a whole bunch of pips, which you'll see why in just a second. Now, what I think might be happening is this person may have disabled, accidentally apparently, delay compensation. Now, delay compensation is going to be in the options menu down here in the bottom section. It is formerly called automatic delay compensation. Right now it's just called delay compensation. Now, what delay compensation does is it compensates for the time that it takes for plugins to do math, or in Britain, maths.
Thank you on behalf of all of us.
There you go. Now, here's the thing, is all math takes time, and different amounts of math will take different amounts of time, right? And so what I've got here, and these are all disabled, but I've got one of the biggest offenders when it comes to this kind of latency, and it's a plugin called Maxim, right? And on this reference tones track, this top track here, I've got 10 maxims in a row, which is the way that I normally mix.
It's just to be sure, right?
Just to be sure, to really get the punch. And it's going to give me a whopping 10,240 samples of latency. Okay?
Wow.
That is definitely going to be a potential problem. Now, if you have a small one, then it could be that 0.2 seconds, right? This is a case taken to the extreme. I've also, just for fun, loaded up a master fader just to show. Now, this first track here is automatic delay compensation is off, and all of these plugins are deactivated. Okay, and what you're going to see, if I can zoom in, let's go the right way. Boink. Okay, so if I zoom in to the very front, there you go. You can see it starts right there. Everything's fine. So if there's no plugins on there, you can have automatic delay compensation on or off. There's no delay to compensate for, right? So no load, all of these plugins being inactive, zero problem. They're going to do exactly the same thing, and they're going to be perfectly aligned and zero problem. This is an internal bounce. This is actually an offline bounce. So this is a bounce to disk, and then I re-imported it. On the next one, I just tried to mix it up. I turned ADC on, the automatic delay compensation on, with no load, and as you might expect, exactly the same, right? So it's going to be the same kind of thing. I'm going to make it up there, and you can see that it's exactly in phase, no problem. Does that make sense, guys? So far, so good?
With you so far.
Right. Now, let's hide these two because we're done with those. Boink, boink. Now, the first thing that I did was I loaded up this audio track, and I didn't load up the master fader just to see what's happening. And what you will find is if automatic delay compensation is off, there's a gap, and this gap happens to be exactly 10,240 samples. I checked it. It is, right? And so the distance from here back to the beginning, trust me on this, down to the sample is 10,240. Right? Why? Because math takes time, and Pro Tools is just letting the math happen. It's not doing anything, right? It's not doing any kind of compensation. It's just letting it go free range.
I'm not going to lie, maths is hard.
It is. It is. The maths is hard. Now, if I turn automatic delay compensation on, this is 10,240 samples of latency, and automatic delay compensation on, and you can see completely fine, right? Zero problem, zero issue.
It's also wait, Andy. That means that the automatic delay compensation actually works, despite everything I read on the forum.
No, it completely works. It completely works.
It's also
Of
worth.
course, it does.
Let's just note that is around about 0.2 seconds. That 10,000 seconds delay, it's about 0.2 seconds.
Well, if he's putting 10 maxims on there, then wow. I doubt that's happening. Well, it may be an MP3.
Do you know, I've got, I think it's one instance of PSP Neon introduced about 15,000 samples of delay. It's a powerful ass plugin. There's a couple even bigger than Maxim. So yeah, it could be one plugin that has just a monster amount. Okay, so those two, we got those two done, right? We're done with those. Now, if you go, whoops. Now this, hold on a second. There we go. I loaded up the master fader track. I unloaded the reference tones from here, and then I loaded it up on the master. So it's the same number of latency, but on a different track, and it's exactly the same thing, right? So again, none of this is a surprise, but it's worth showing because it actually is doing what it says that it does. And then this one down here is with all of it on. So you can see here that the latency is just about double this. So basically what this means to show is that if you're not compensating for the latency will happen. Now, at the risk of becoming preachy,
One of the things that makes Pro Tools the professional choice for a lot of people is that our plugins have to report their latency. It's in the plugin's design. They have to report their latency to the Pro Tools mix engine so that they can be compensated for. This is not something that happens with VST plugins. It's not something that happens with any format other than AAX plugins. Why? Because Avid is so adamant, and the people who make plugins for Pro Tools have to be approved. They have to meet these requirements or else it can't get into Pro Tools, because this one element is so important. Now, if you're using a wrapper with VSTs on it, all bets are off. But if you're using AAX plugins, this just works. Okay, it does what it's supposed to do. And you can see over here that so these guys are all doing what they're supposed to be doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that commentary on using wrappers, and Blue Cat is one of them, right? I think Blue Cat's Patchwork is probably one of the top wrappers. It's not.
Yep. Oh, completely.
Not delay compensating.
It does. Well, the wrapper does, but the plugins inside don't.
Doesn't.
Right.
What are we going to go on to next?
So the last thing I'm going to show here is going to be what some people think is the difference between recording with automatic delay compensation on or off.
Okay. Well, in that case, let's have a look at that after this.
All right. So the last thing I wanted to look at, because this is another thing that folks are a little bit confused, is when to use automatic delay compensation, when not to use it. And the answer to that question is, for most people, leave it on all the time. And a lot of folks will say, even during recording, yes, because again, Pro Tools is smart enough to be able to make the calculations. So what I did for the last kind of examples is I put my microphone kind of close to my speakers and I recorded through, so to make sure that the recording latency was as small as possible. Now, there is latency in my interface, which is not an HD interface, so that if you have a non-Avid HD interface, that is not automatically delay compensated for. So the automatic delay the analog to digital conversion, the digital to analog conversion, that's outside of this engine, right? So there is going to be some slop with some pieces of gear if it's non-Avid, because we just don't know the latency of the interfaces. But beyond that, if you take a look over here, so if I turned automatic delay compensation off and I played the signal from this track through the speakers back in, you can see that there's a gap between when it gets recorded back. Why? Because the maths takes time, right? And you're not asking Pro Tools to compensate for it. So if it's off, then that's what you're going to get. If I'm recording with automatic delay compensation on, so I'll turn it back on, and this is the result that I got, and boom, now it's right on, or it's very, very close down to the round trip of the analog to digital conversion, digital to analog conversion. So, if all this is to say is that it could be MP3, it almost certainly has nothing to do with internal or offline bounces. Or real-time bounces. That is probably not a factor. This could be the other possible factor, and it's such a mysterious topic for so many people. I figured maybe this is a good one to talk about, the three of us.
You were right, and it's I'm still thinking it's the perfect companion to that MP3 question that we answered a few episodes ago, because this is almost an extension to it, isn't it? Bouncing to MP3 is going to be one reason why you get that gap. And delay compensation with 10 instances of Maxim is the other.
That was a really good demo, Andy. And for anyone interested in doing this at home and trying to replicate the results, you will get the exact same result as Andy. There is nothing strange to this. This simply just works.
So let's before we jump off, just real quickly to show how this works and what you can see and what you can change down here in the mix window. So right now I have no delay. All these other tracks are just inactive because they're just a whole bunch of sine waves. This works for a big session or a small session. This just happens to be a simple and small session. Now, if I go ahead here and I reactivate this, so this maxim is now on, you'll see that one track is going to have an amber kind of a color. That track is is basically the lead dog, right? It's the track that has the most latency in it, and you'll see that this first track that has no plugins on it is being compensated, right? So there is 1024 samples of latency being added to this track to keep everything lined up and in phase, that's essentially mathematically how automatic delay compensation works, is it makes all the tracks exactly as late as the most latent track. If I went over here onto this other track on the master fader, and I'll make this active. Now both of these have 1024. Now, what's going to happen if I put more load on the master fader track? Well, now you'll see here that this is 2048 samples of latency. This one's only 1024 samples of latency. This one is 1024 samples of latency as well. Now, why isn't this being compensated? Why is there no compensation on this track going to the main mon?
Well, because there's nothing happening after the master, so that one doesn't really need to get compensated, right?
That's right. That's right. So the master fader is a little bit of a different beast, although it is still factored in. Now, if I went with this, now you're going to see here that this one now becomes lead dog, and because it's internal, because it's prior to the master fader, you'll see here this is now 2048, and then this is going to be 2048, and this is just telling you the load on this, but it doesn't live in the same realm, right? And that's the correct functioning of all of this, right? So Pro Tools is smart enough to keep it all lined up together. However, you have some control over this, right? So one of the things that you can do is you can turn it off. Now, again, unless you really have a reason to turn it off, don't. Leave it on during recording. As you could see that it compensated for the latency of the other playback tracks, so everything was fine. And from a performance standpoint, there was no latency in my headphones, because automatic delay compensation on any recording track is suspended. So it turns off on any recording track. Automatic delay compensation is temporarily turned off, and then once the recording's done, it shifts it around so that it lines up with the rest of your song. Now, so you could turn it off if you wanted to, and then what's going to happen is this all goes stupid. There are a couple other things that you can do. One of them is you can nudge individual tracks by samples. So you can nudge by plus or minus however many samples you want, and that exists in addition to the compensation. So this second row down on each of the tracks is a separate additional number. So right now there's compensation, which is 2048. I can add or subtract samples from that figure, and I can nudge tracks around sample by sample. Rarely do I have to do it, but it's power that you do have. The final thing that you can do is you can treat this like a plugin, and you can make it inactive. Right click, disable plugin delay, means that this will not report or be latent. It exists outside of the rest of your mix. It's still part of your mix, but from a delay compensation perspective, it just stepped out of the ring. And again, that's a right click, and you can right click to enable it, or the shortcut is going to be Control Command, which is the same thing that you would use to disable or enable, activate or inactivate any plugin in your window. So you can selectively, add, remove tracks from the landscape of automatic delay compensation. None of those things do I do frequently, and I don't take that matter lightly. So I can count the amount of times that I've even messed with this outside of a classroom on one hand, right?
Yeah,
so
can I jump in on one situation where
Sure.
it actually where it's very useful to do this, and this is also a question. I just popped it in our internal chat here. If you want to read on that, I hope that was the question. There's a guy having a problem basically recording a click, but it can also happen if you're using a hardware synthesizer. So if you're using a hardware synthesizer, you're using that on an instrument track or something, and you're routing that back into Pro Tools, obviously, and you want to record that synthesizer on an audio track to be able to like insert plugins, or I don't know, you just want a recording of it, which is reasonable. Okay, so what will happen is Pro Tools will automatically delay compensate, of course, when recording. And what you will end up with is something that people just can't believe their eyes when they see that, because of automatic delay compensation, everything is compensated, and the actual recorded clip might even start before the MIDI clip starts. So it would be ahead of time. And this, of course, looks ridiculous. And what you have to do, or what you have to understand there, is it's just the automatic delay compensation actually doing what it's supposed to do. And in that case, you have to enter something called the blue mode. Andy, did you show that?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so the blue mode is when you exclude a track from the automatic delay compensation, and that is you go down to the DLY, the delay button down there, which is the actual amount, not that one, on the audio track itself, Andy, on the left track. You have to go to the bottom where it says delay, and that's the amount of delay it's recorded and able to. So just if you don't do that quite yet, and if you re-enable the delay compensation here, and when you hit record, if you record enable this track, you will see something, and that is the automatic delay compensation is grayed out, because
that's right.
You don't want to have a delay when you're singing to the microphone. That track is excluded from the delay compensation automatically. And in this case, you will actually record early, and Pro Tools is smart enough to align it, but when you're recording an external synthesizer, it will get messed up. So, so if you now control command click on the delay button, like Andy did before, it turns blue, which is the blue mode. So it's excluded from this automatic delay compensation, and everything will get recorded sample accurate, even though if the scenario that I just explained. So this is a very rare thing. It's only if you are trying to record something outside of Pro Tools that is already delay compensated.
Yeah, so that's such a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. So you can exclude in two different ways. You can exclude this track from reporting its latency. You could also exclude a track from reacting to other reports, right? So it's two different ways of working. Anders, you mentioned the workflow that that we should be using when we do recording with MIDI on that. This blue mode is 100% right and 0% wrong. Fantastic.
Not regular MIDI, but external hardware MIDI. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not just the MIDI notes. It's the audio that comes from it. Yeah.
So, as usual, a lot to talk about. I think it ended up down a very deep rabbit hole with delay compensation. So I think the answer to the original question is that there are a couple of ways. We can link you to the MP3 video that talks about bouncing to MP3, and that can introduce a little bit of delay. So that's something that you can check out. Or if you're using delay compensation, turning delay compensation off using very heavy plugins, there's a couple of ways that delay will be introduced into your bounce. So I think that covers as many bases as we can think of, certainly at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 4 o'clock respectively. Maybe after more coffee something else will appear, I don't know.
There you go.
So I hope that helped, and I hope that helped all of you guys as well. If you're liking what you're doing, please subscribe to Pro Tools Answers. Hit the bell icon so that you know when we're releasing all of our videos. We do regularly on Sunday, and occasionally during the week if there's anything interesting that we want to talk about or anything that we want to highlight from our videos as well. You'll get a notification of those. You can head over to ProToolsAnswers.com and subscribe to us over there. You'll get a lovely email from Andy every so often, and a free little gift if you are into your mastering and want to make things a little bit wider than normal. So go and check that out as well. If you fancy supporting us on Patreon, or you feel that you'd like to support us on Patreon,
did Dave's video stream just freeze, or is it just?
I think Dave he's either
he's doing a practical joke,
or he's thinking.
He's doing a practical joke on us, I think.
As far as I know, I'm still going. That's not going to make it on the video, Anders, that's for sure. If you want to support us on Patreon, you can head over to patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers, and you can drop us a couple of bucks every month over there. There are some member benefits as well, including mugs and t-shirts. And if you want to see an example of a Pro Tools Answers mug, you can check out our last episode where our buddy Mike was demoing the use of a mug. So there's no boundaries of what we'll demonstrate on Pro Tools Answers. We'll demonstrate the use of a coffee mug as well. So all he's been to say is thank you very much to Anders.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thanks to Andy.
You bet.
My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers. We'll see you next time, and we're out.